Hello 8th graders and other middle schoolers who might one day be doing a cornhole project. Today I'm going to go over a lot of the steps for the cornhole project, and I'm not necessarily going to demonstrate on the actual size just because that's a lot of wood, but I'm going to make a smaller prototype and show you a lot of the steps that you'll go through. So hopefully after this video you feel prepared when you come into the shop and you have a little bit of background knowledge and you'll be ready to go. So I'm going to start with the track saw. So when we're cutting cornhole boards, we're going to have a huge piece of plywood that's 4 feet by 8 feet. This has already been cut down, but basically we're going to cut that into 4 pieces. And so I'm going to do the same thing with this smaller piece to demonstrate that. Whenever you're cutting a big piece of plywood that's very awkward, you want to get set up, and I'm just using scrap 2x4. And this will allow me to cut on top of my table without going into the tabletop. So the blade will go a little bit lower and cut into the wood. You have to have it secured kind of everywhere so that the board's not going to wobble. Now, if I want to cut this board down the length, which is the way we're going to cut the 4x8 sheets, I need to measure how wide it is and divide that by 2. This is 24 inches, so I'm going to make a little mark at 12. And another one down here at 12. And then I'm going to set up my track. This is a straight edge that the saw rides on like a rail. And so I get on that line, and I'm wanting to go exactly on the line so that this piece will be the same width as this piece. So I got that set up. The nice thing about this track saw is that it has a vacuum that'll collect the dust as we cut. So you just plug that in the back, and then because it's connected to the vacuum, when I turn this on, it'll automatically turn the vacuum on. So you'll put your goggles on, and this is something that I'm going to help you with that you'll be able to do. This track kind of stays strong by itself. You're going to push the safety button with your thumb and then squeeze the trigger, and then the saw will push down and start cutting all the way through the cut. So here we go. Okay, and now your big board is in half the long way, and we're going to come back and cut it this way. So same thing. Measure halfway. This is 48 inches, so I'm going to go to 24. This keeps us square. When I do this, I'm actually just going to do one of these at a time. And you actually have to make sure that your boards are going perpendicular to your cut. So I'm cutting like this. So my cut is going this way. My boards underneath are going this way. So there's a little bit of strength under each side of the cut. That way the board doesn't fall down when you're doing the cut. You can kind of see on this piece how the cut went into the wood, and that keeps our tabletop nice. So get it lined up right where I want the cut. Get it on the track, and then safety trigger. Do that one more time. right, and that step is finished. So just like you're going to do on a huge board, we had our big board, and I cut it down into 4 pieces. We also kept the grain going the long way, because on a cornhole set, that kind of looks nicer. If I keep going, we're ready to put a hole in the top where the cornhole goes, where you're trying to score. So to do this, there's a specific diagram, and you'll get diagrams for every piece you're cutting. But you can see on the actual cornhole board, you need to come 12 inches over, because this is a 24-inch wide board, and 9 inches down. That's the center of your circle. On these, it's a little bit different because they're smaller, but I'm still going to demonstrate that. I'm going to go 6 down. And since this is a 12-inch wide board, I'm coming 6 over. So that little mark forms the center of my circle. That's where I'm going to cut this. Now when you're drilling this hole, you got to make sure that you have a good setup for how you're going to do your drilling. I'm going to do this drilling off the edge. If you've seen my other clamp videos, put it under, drop the top, turn it right, make it tight. Put it under, drop the top, turn it right, make it tight. Now I got a good solid hold on my board. Make sure I have my drill bit in properly. This is a 6-inch diameter, and the center of the inside drill bit will help find my center, and that'll keep me in the right spot. So I'm right on there. Now when I do this, it's a lot like drilling any other drill bit, but because it's hitting so much wood at the same time, it wants to slow the drill down. So you're just going to do a slight bit of going around in a tiny little circle as you're pushing down. So just kind of watch how I do it, and when you're actually here in person, I'll give you some more tips. And you got yourself a nice little circle. These are things you should always save because you can do cool stuff with them. I think first graders might use these to make some gears. So we'll save that. And we have ourselves the start of a nice cornhole board. Now at this point, at this point, you're going to have 2 groups. Basically, you're going to have a design group and a build group. Once you get here, before you start doing any design on this, you need to get the board ready and prepped for design and painting and anything you're going to decorate this with. So now I'm going to go over some hand sanding, and it may seem very simple, and it is. And it helps sometimes if I hold it right over the edge, and I can do the bottom that way too. And I can feel that's already nice and smooth, no splinters. When I come to the corners, just kind of round them over a tiny bit. And I notice I'm not pushing overly hard. It's just a very light back and forth motion. So that's it. That's all that's needed on every edge. When you come to the circle, since a block is not what you want, you could grab something round. Let's see. You need a dowel, or you can even a pen would work or something. You probably want to use a dowel rod. I'm just grabbing this because I have it handy. And now I have a round form. And I'm just going to kind of do the same thing on one side and the other. Now you can see those bags will slip right in to the hole if you're any good. So, hand sanding, just make sure you get all the splinters off, and you almost can't sand too much, but as long as you get it enough that it's no splinters and has a slight round over, that's what you're looking for. And that's hand sanding. Once this board is sanded, then the design crew will go into the Makerspace and do their thing with decorating the boards and making them look cool. After that, we're going to move on to building the base structure. Now, I'm going to show an example base structure and all the actual size parts that you'll need on a board that's already built. So you can see on this board here, see this is the front, and it has this big base structure on here. And you see all these boards with all these little holes drilled, and you have legs that open out like this. This base is what the build team is going to work on in the shop. I have this set here, and anytime you're making a bunch of something like a production, like in a factory or something, you might have something like this. This is sometimes just called the master set or the jigs, and these are the exact pieces that you're all going to be making. So technically, if Tommy makes a base or Jenny makes a base or whoever, it doesn't matter because the bases should all be uniform. So any base could go on any top, and that's kind of how we're going to do this process. So as long as everybody follows the steps, we'll get nice, similar bases. So in this set, you can see, if I set this up over here, I have an outside piece, another outside piece. I have the bottom piece, top piece, so that forms a rectangle. These pieces go on the inside like this. Then I have a little board coming up the middle and one going across the middle horizontal. And what that does is that helps when you throw the bags on the board. The bag doesn't bounce as much. It's not as hollow feeling, and it's a little more durable. And then eventually you're going to have leg cuts like this. Notice that the angle is not cut on yet. It's still square. That's because at the end, once we get our leg in with the hardware, we're going to actually hang it over the edge of a table to the exact height we need, and we'll draw a parallel line to the table. That's going to give us a much better fit, and it's very custom. And it also helps when your top board maybe has a tiny bit of warping, which sometimes happens with plywood. So for this step, for these steps, there's a specific cut list, and here's why. Anytime you're doing a lot of woodwork, you're spending a lot of money on lumber, and you want to make sure you maximize it. So my list right here that you'll all get a copy of shows your cut pattern. So these big rectangles represent poplar boards. That's a type of wood. It's a common Indiana tree. It is Indiana's tree, the poplar. And this shows the pattern that you're going to do with all the different labels for what the boards are, and even the leg dimensions. So that's what we're trying to follow. So looking at a poplar board, I purchased all this wood from Northwest Lumber, which is a great company close to Orchard. And most of these boards are very nice and squared. You can look down the end, and if you ever go to Lowe's or Home Depot, Menards, you might see somebody doing this, and it's kind of a good sign because it tells you they know what they're looking for. They're looking for square, straight boards that aren't warped. And so once we have this, we're kind of looking at our pattern and saying, okay, I need 2 of my long boards, and those are A, so those are 46 3/8. Now this is 8 feet, 8 times 12 is 96, so I can get 2 of those out of this, and you'll see that there'll be a little bit of waste at the bottom, right down here, if I cut that properly. Now you could cut this, you could clamp this and cut it with a handsaw, but using a handsaw sometimes is hard because it doesn't get you the nicest square cut. So we're going to actually be using a tool called a tile saw, which there's a separate video to the tile saw. And for today, I'm not going to cut this board up. I'm going to demonstrate on some other wood. All right, so now I'm ready to cut all of my poplar stock, and we're going to do it on the tile saw so we get nice square cuts. I have my mark made right where I need, and get it lined up, goggles on. Remember, this has a safety, thumb button, and then trigger. Here we go. All right, so we have a lot more of these to do until we get our whole set made. And one thing you might notice is that in this set, the boards that are in the middle, these 2 that come like this up the middle of the board, they're narrower. And so you have to cut down the middle here. And that's called a rip cut when you're doing a long cut this way. If you're cutting across the grain, it's called a cross cut. It's easier to cut that way. So for the rip cuts, I'm going to be doing that on the table saw over here. And this is a tool that I'll use. I'll have you help me line it up using the ruler over here. But basically, we're going to get our blade. When you use a table saw, you always want the blade to come just a little bit above. Maximize your blade. And I'm going half of 3 1/2, which is 1 3/4. So I'm setting that just off 1 3/4 because of the math of the blade. And I'm going to run this. So we double our pieces, and when you look at this diagram, what you can see is that with our B- boards and our C boards, those are the ones where you'll first cut it out of poplar, and then I'll come back and that little dotted line is the rip cut that I just did. So that's how we're maximizing our wood. So now I have those pieces, and I have all my other pieces, and I'm ready to start doing my pocket hole drilling. Now you've seen the whole video on pocket hole drilling. So I'm not going to add that to this piece, but what I am going to show is screwing a Craig screw into a pocket hole, because that was not included in that video. And to do that, I'm going to use a scrap piece that I have over here. This is my Craig system that you've already seen. And so I have a board, and I've already drilled the pocket holes. And now I want to attach this to a piece of wood here, because these are what your ends are going to be like. So step one when you're doing this is we'll get this all clamped up and ready to go. So I want to make that a tight joint that will fit really strong. And in order to do that, you're going to be clamping what you screw in. So we're going to get this loosely clamped here. And I'm going to make sure it's right on the edge, and I have a nice square corner there. See that? Comes down, and that piece is flush with this piece. And that's what everybody has to do a really good job of being uniform about, because every base could fit for any top. And now I'm ready to drill screws into there. When you do this, this can be very tricky, and if you mess up, there's very little room for error, I guess. And if this part gets messed up, we have to remake the boards. And then we're into an issue of having enough time and all that. So we want to make sure we don't mess up. In order to do that, you're always going to want to test your pieces. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drill this in with the correct bit. These Craig screws have a square head, so I use a square driver. You can see it fits right in there. Now, if I were to have this on drill, that's the strongest power. That means it just keeps drilling no matter what. That's way too strong. It'll keep going and rip through the wood. So I'm going to set it to a low torque. I'm going to go to like 3. That means when it gets enough resistance, it'll stop, and you'll hear it. Before I even do that, though, I want to make sure I test the depth of my screw, so that's all the way in, and I see that when it's together, it will not come through the top surface of the board, through the side here that we're going. It's not going to come through there. That's what we want to make sure of. And now that I know that that's good, and I've tested, I'll go back. I'm going to do my clamp. And for the purposes of this video, I'm going to put the screws on the outside because I want you to see what's happening a little easier. It really helps to have a couple people help you hold this sometimes when you're clamping. Okay. So I got that right on the end, squared, and now I want to drill this in. Remember, I have it on a very soft torque. Again, we will test this before you ever actually go into your real piece. You hear that noise? It has enough resistance, and the torque, that means how strong something can turn, is stopping itself from going any further. That's good. That's what we want. And so now I'm going to get my correct hand screwdriver that has a square bit, and I can do the last little quarter turn by hand, because then you can really feel how tight you're getting. And you just need it tight enough that it adds a little bit of pressure. If you go too tight, what happens is you keep spinning the screw and you rip out the wood in there, and that's called stripping the screw, or stripping the threads sometimes. But once we do that, these connections will be very strong, and that's the whole foundation of how we put our base together. And so that's Kreg screwing. Once you have that, you have your whole base set up, and then we got to attach the bases to the top. So in this scenario, you can see how if this is a finished top, and I'd have my base, I'd already have my Kreg screws drilled. And so let me grab a piece that has that. You can see how this one has the screws going into the side pieces, but then it also has the downward hole that's ready to sit, and this whole base will get screwed onto the frame here. Or the frame will get screwed onto the top. And then you'll have this nice frame system that will be ready to accept legs. Now, there's a couple more pieces to this video. The main one I'm going to go over is the leg, and I'm not going to do the entire leg system, but I am just going to give you a general understanding. And so we'll start with these two jigs that I have. You can see here, this is sort of the corner of the underside of a frame. And so if with my board on top, I have my wood that turns and my leg gets hidden, stays in the frame, and then you're ready to play, so you open it up and it hits right here and it sets, and then that has a slight angle going down, and that's a lot of exact geometry that we're going to go over that helps you get that angle. But basically you need to cut this leg out, and so we have a couple options for that. On our wood, we could either use what's called a jig. That's something that helps you do a job easier. And I can trace my leg. That's one way to do it. I could also use a compass. And this would allow us to draw this radius on the leg. I could draw the radius of my leg. For this, I'm going to draw and use my jig that I have set up. I'm even going to show where the hole goes. And for now, I'm just doing a sort of a dotted line. But when you cut your pieces out from your cut list, you're actually going to have a bigger leg like this, like I showed you a little bit earlier. Okay? We can take this to our cut. And now we need to round this over. Now you've seen the bandsaw video before, so I'm not going to go over all the details of this, but I'll just go ahead and cut this out. You'll notice how close I got to the line, but I never came inside the line. And now to get that final rounding to match the shape we actually want, we're going to come over to the oscillating spindle sander. And this is where this turns, and it's turning this way. So it wants to pull the wood away from you. So you want to come back toward the turn. And for this, you're just lightly pushing. You're going right to that line. There you go, you have a much better turn. And we can come back and hand sand this all smooth. And at the very end is when we're going to hold it off the edge at the right angle, and we're going to draw that line so we get an exact cut on that angle. And so that's the leg portion. The last kind of thing we have to do is go over putting the hardware in. I have my hole right here. And so once I'm in my side frame, and my leg is like this with the proper geometry, and this is held off the end, it's going to go like that. We're going to trace that line when it's the right height, cut it, and basically all we're doing is putting the hardware through. So I'm not really going to show too much about this because it's relatively simple. But basically, you're going to use washers, a bolt, and a lock nut. And that's a nut that has a little rubber crimp in here that will hold it on and keep it tight in place. So when you put the pieces together, you'll see, I already have it done here, there's a washer that goes on, then this goes through. Before you put the leg on, you'll add another washer to give yourself a tiny little space here. Then you'll put the leg on, then you'll put another washer on the outside of the leg, then you'll put the lock nut on. And you can see that process has already been done here. And now you got a leg that rotates just like you want it. Those are basically the steps to cornhole. There's a lot of other things that we're going to be going over in person. And this video kind of gives you just a general idea of the overall steps that you're going to take when you're in here. And if we do this the right way, we're going to end up with a lot of cornhole sets and have a fun tournament at the end. So that's it for the cornhole video. I hope you enjoyed, and I'm excited for you to come to the shop and get started.